So I'm a consultant with a little consultancy in strategy and innovation based up in Surrey Hills, and we do a lot of work with big organisations to help them unpack the assumptions that their businesses are resting on. So in a changing world, what things are at risk to their organisation, and we help them kind of design learning experiences so they can then change their business and make better decisions in relation to those things. So things like AI, climate change, whatever it is. So I studied at University of New South Wales in the built environment for my PhD. And I'd just like to start with a bit of like setup about what kind of time that we're living in. It's one where a lot of these paradigms that we've had for a very long time are starting to kind of dissolve, and we're thinking that a lot of the things we've known for centuries are now starting to really be challenged in this new, very kind of socio-technical world for one thing, but we've seen things like we thought we'd mastered nature, and now nature's kind of turning on us slightly, so what are we going to do about that? So maybe our confidence should be a little bit shaken. We thought we'd mastered technology as well, and of course, like all technological systems, there's side effects, which often we don't find out for a long period of time in the future. And also that we've kind of evolved with our technologies as well. We're no longer anything like we were a century, millennia ago, even a century ago. And how can our little brains keep up with all of this? We now have these really big global issues which have been called hyperobjects by Timothy Morton, which are things like climate change, things like the internet. They're actual real things, but they're kind of outside the scope of things that we can really experience as humans. So we have to kind of use our imagination to think about those things. And things like climate change, we're all expected to do something in relation to that, but you have to just imagine what it is or be told what it is, and it's hard to kind of understand how your little realm of experience relates to those issues. So this has been described as we've moved from normal to post-normal times, where we're suddenly questioning, okay, what are the political structures that we have? Like, what is the nature of family, gender? All these things that have been unquestioned for quite a while are now kind of up in the air again. And these categories are starting to have blurry edges, and we're starting to question the need for those categories at all. So a lot of the tools we have to describe the world are really ill-fitted to this time that's getting increasingly complex, that's emerging very quickly. The agency of technology is increasing exponentially, and far greater than we can possibly understand as mortal, fallible humans. So sometimes we look at systems and think, I can't understand this, it's too complex, it's too big, I don't know where to start. So I'm going to talk tonight about some tools to help you start to describe the world again and forget some of those previous categories that might be shaping the way you look at them. So how can we understand complex systems so we can design them better? So I think the precursor to good design is actually having a sense of how that system works, but you can describe systems in an infinite number of ways. So it's really a matter of finding the ways to describe a system and understand a system that is most useful to what you're trying to do with that system. So there's some earlier examples of like, I've done a lot of work, and my PhD was in the transport system in Sydney. So you can look at transport as a political problem, you can look at it as an engineering problem, you can look at it as a social problem, and each of those will encourage a different kind of worldview of looking at that, and you will omit a lot of things taking one of those lenses. So yeah, each one will kind of lead you to a different way of intervening in that system. So thinking about how what you can actually do in it is shaped by what you think that system actually is. So before you start, really question which lens you're looking through when you look at a system. And then also in the process of looking in those systems, think again, am I looking at this the right way? And am I writing down or representing or thinking about, talking about the right things, or what am I always missing? So our default lens is already very biased. So you might find a lot of people in the room that'll look at a system the same way, but that doesn't mean that that's the way to look at a system. So I've been using all different types of social theory to explore systems, and each one of those that you adopt will end up you seeing a system and understanding it a different way. So I like this idea that we inhabit the solutions to yesterday's problems. So the built world and designed world in which we live is all the solutions to a problem of another time. And some of them are still relevant, some of them aren't. Our worldview is really built on centuries, millennia past of what is valued, what is good, what do you care about, how do you have a good life, how do you do a job. So at the moment these things are kind of all up for question again. So the Western mind, as an example, which is quite dominant in the world, has been shaped by some very powerful ideas. The Judeo-Christian tradition, so obviously the church in the West has been very, very powerful. It kind of presupposes there's one God, there is one kind of truth, one way to know the world, and you've got to be good against a certain set of rules about how you do well. Scientific rationalism is the idea that everything that can be measured by science is real, and everything that isn't is not real. And Cartesian rationalism, which I'm going to talk about today, was this idea by René Descartes, which was, I think, therefore I am, which kind of flowed through into the mind being greater than the body. And then that's kind of flowed through to us thinking that culture is more powerful and greater than nature. And actually, if we think about the last 400 years that these ideas have been about, they've become very powerful. And as Mika was saying earlier, some of these categorizations have kind of set our brains, and we've ended up categorizing things in these different ways. So if you look at the ways universities, for example, have developed, you'll rarely find disciplines that can actually cross that boundary. So you'll have social science, you'll have natural sciences, you'll have physics, you'll have humanities. Design is something that crosses that boundary, but if you go and study historically, I think transdisciplinary design is a fantastic example of trying to cross those boundaries a little bit. So yeah, this idea that it kind of manifests in this idea that theory is more pure and better than practice, and practice is a little bit dirty. And this has created this kind of false dichotomy or false choice in a lot of the work that we might do, where we think we've got to take theory from academia and go and put that in practice, and then if you write something you put it back in theory. But really these aren't actually real differences. I mean, well, they are if you live to this kind of these differences. So getting to socio-technical systems, this kind of manifests that humans kind of have control over technology, that we are masters of it, we build it, and it does things for us. But really now in this time, what is human and what is technology? And I think that boundary is really starting to blur. So we know that people's brains are changing with apps and GPSs and maps, and we know that people's brains got bigger when they started farming. So we're actually shaped by technology as much as we shape technology. And so technology now is kind of blending in many ways with us. So when we think about human-centric design, system-oriented design, human-centered design is kind of related to this idea of humanism, which happened in business. So there was Taylorism as an idea which kind of reduced humans into like little increments of time, and it really just took the humanity out of business and system. So you think the classic kind of Henry Ford model of production. Well, that's Fordism, that's another thing as well. But like reducing and saying, you know, a human just does like clocked amount of time and everything is little increments of time. And then humanism came along by Edwin Mayo, and he was saying, well, you know, actually systems and human systems can be more productive if you think about people and let them enjoy their work, which was a novel idea at the time. And so there's a certain amount of things kind of wrapped up in that idea. So the other one is anthropocentrism, which is the way humans look at the world is a very human view of the world, which is why we probably have a lot of trouble dealing with things like climate change, because we're very us-centric, but we can't help that unless we do things to change the way we represent systems. So yeah, we're moving into a time where people are starting to blend with technology a bit. It's this kind of blurred edge where you can't say a human is this bounded entity that is just one thing. We all know now, like lots more kind of people have lots of different identities in different social circles, and there isn't just one person all the time. They meld and shape based on those social circumstances that they're in. But also we're melding with technology, so think about the smartphone, for example, the internet. Our capabilities are expanded, but they're also reduced in other ways. So if we think about systems properly, we need to think about a post-human-centered view of the world, and particularly where to address the ecological problems that we're in at the moment. So I came across one school of thought which was very interesting in addressing these type of issues, which is philosophical pragmatism. So it's really, pragmatism focuses on experience and what is experienced, and thinking about what are the practical effects of holding certain ideas. So ideas like Descartes' mind-body dichotomy, how does that manifest, and is that actually the best way we can think about the world? And so even the fact we have to say socio-technical systems is because we have to bring together those two worlds that were separated. And you would just say probably systems to say both of those things, because you can't really now have a human system that is outside of technology, because we exist in a technological world. So there's kind of no way to extract a pure social system out of the built world. And vice versa, we understand systems through our lens, so you can't really understand a technical system as being a purely technical system, because our perceptions and what we call things and how we relate to it really matter. They're not outside of that system. So this whole set of philosophical ideas is really old. It started probably 140 years ago in America by this bunch of dudes who they lived at a time, interestingly enough, when they went to college. They didn't have disciplines in the way that we have them now. So they were doctors, they were philosophers, they were interested in politics, education, and their kind of time when they were studying, they covered all of those areas. So they were actually quite insightful when they were writing, because they could talk about these patterns across a lot of systems, where I think over the last century things have kind of become more and more categorised and more separated, so their ideas are actually super relevant again. So the original three there, Charles Sanders Peirce and John Dewey and William James, they were really rebelling against the power of science at the time, and they were really against this idea that you could have objective truth. And the way people said, oh, I found this new theory, it's truth, it is the way of the world, and they were saying, well, no, like this is just the latest hypothesis that we have. So they had a different view of truth, which was just the things that most people agree on are the things that are believed to be kind of true. And then a lot of these ideas were taken late last century. Richard Rorty kind of came in after postmodernism and was talking about how language and pragmatism, talked about the relationship between language and pragmatism, about how paradigm shifts happen, and how language and the words that we use, and once everyone starts using those words, that's when it becomes truth in that way. So there's a few kind of tenets of pragmatism, which I'll talk about very, very briefly, and I think they're very interesting because they're kind of against the dominant kind of Western canon or history in a way. So one is to think of things as evolutionary. So everything is in kind of a process and flow, and everything kind of follows that which has come before, and it'll change in the future. So they were really obsessed with Darwin's theory of evolution at the time, which was brand new. And they really liked that idea and thought that actually applies to the way we have ideas, and philosophies is the same thing. So someone will have an idea and eventually it'll become a more powerful one, and the other one will be kind of pushed aside. But there is no appealing to what is the actual truth. It's just the one that most people can agree on. They were also against metaphysical systems, so that's like how we think about reality, and particularly things like where we think there's a hierarchy between things in the world. So thinking that theory is better than practice. So they would dismantle those and talk about those things as if they were always equal. They were against these dualisms, and particularly the Cartesian rational dualism. So when they talked about things, they would bring a lot of these things together. So theory and practice as another one, they would talk about the same way. And they thought about things ecologically. So John Dewey was all about environmentalism, and they see things not as linear progressions, but spatial arrangements of relations. So, and not all of their ideas agree with each other as well. It's not like there's one exact book of this is pragmatism. They all had slightly different views. So you're not going to exactly find that, but these are kind of tenets that were pretty similar across a lot of their ideas. So it's to understand the world as in the making. So the world is full of incomplete things that are constantly being changed rather than these bounded fixed entities. So as an example, in my research, when I started, I was thinking about organisations as bounded entities with kind of walls, and there's people inside, and then there's other organisations which are also bounded. And I noticed in my early questions when I was interviewing lots of people, Transport for New South Wales and all the other organisations I was working with, that I was talking about things like, what are the interfaces between your organisations? And in my language, I was using a lot of these concepts, which kind of start dissolving when you start using pragmatic ways of looking at the world. And so, just to go back to that, philosophical pragmatism is, I'm calling it philosophical pragmatism because it's different to the pragmatism you probably know, which is more of a Machiavellian kind of pursuit for a result, whereas this is more kind of a way of understanding the world, and particularly how ideas form and evolve. So there's a more contemporary version of pragmatism which I used, which is a version of social theory called actor network theory, which uses a lot all of those pragmatic kind of tenets to describe how systems evolve and change. So it's particularly used in understanding innovation and how that takes place, and how, so there's books written by Bruno Latour on like pasteurization in France, so how Louis Pasteur managed to get the whole of France to use pasteurized milk. And when you take this actor network theory approach, it's not just one guy with a revolutionary idea who convinces everyone to use it, but it's this combination of things in emergence. So germ theory came along, which meant that people suddenly cared about pasteurization, even though he'd worked out how to do that and didn't really know the value of it. And so when you look at these systems, actor network theory, they get very, very complex very, very quickly, and everything kind of relates to everything else. But it is this kind of, it has views socio-technical systems as in constant emergence, and it looks at how certain technologies and people are able to draw more technologies and people into their ideas and into their way of doing things. So similarly to the pragmatist idea of how ideas form, actor network theories kind of takes that idea and then applies that to socio-technical systems, basically. So it looks at the world also through this experimental lens that a lot of things fail and a lot of things don't go anywhere. So you kind of talk about things as becoming stronger associations and being able to enroll more things in it, or becoming weaker and kind of moving away in different ways. It also flattens things like theory and practice. So actor network theory looks through exactly the same lens at how academic research is done versus how you do an innovation project. So the ability to write a good theoretical paper involves you convincing a lot of people that your ideas are legitimate and that you should be published in that journal, and it takes a lot of work to convince those people. You can't just come up with a random theory and get it published into those things and get people to believe it. It takes a long time, and you have to be certain status, come up through the right ranks in order to make that happen. And so when you look at innovation, it's a similar process where, you know, it's a matter of convincing a lot of people that your idea is good. So I'm sure a lot of people in this room have had great ideas, and no, it's not that simple. So they also bridge this gap between human and non-human, as they call it, which is the symmetry of both. So they look at agency of human and non-humans. So for example, this projector is attracting attention. That's good, that's intended. But it has an agency in the room as I do talking to you. And so all the actors in a system, so it talks a lot about actors, whether human or non-human, they're all defined by their relations and not through prior definitions. So you don't say a politician is powerful. You would say they are powerful in these ways when they exert certain influence on certain people. You have to be quite specific when you explain those things. So it looks at the world as these assemblages of human and non-human actors that are all entangled together, that all relate to each other, and you're constantly kind of pulled between these different you're enrolled into different systems constantly. So we might be enrolled in our work, which we go to every day, but we're also maybe on social media or in Social Design Sydney. And all of those networks that we're in are a different makeup of human and non-human actors. So for example, the Eventbrite website, which you'll use to get a ticket, is an actor in this system that helps to draw you into that network. So I was really fascinated by this idea and thinking about how when people talk about smart cities, which was the context that I was working in, I was looking at real-time information systems in Sydney transport and how projects actually emerge. So it's often connected to this smart city discourse, which is very utopian, very ill-defined, and it often talks at things on the city level. So it ranks cities against each other. A lot of studies are about either socio or technical outcomes, and they kind of say technology is good or bad. But I was really interested in kind of, okay, what's a project that's already happening, and how can we understand it in this really like pragmatic, grounded kind of way? So I've spent a couple of years mapping 2 projects. So I did 25 interviews with a lot of people. I attended lots of workshops. One of them was the development of real-time apps. So TripView, you probably have all heard of. And then another project was developing responsive information system for bus stops and train stations. And that project didn't end up going anywhere because the apps kind of like ate all the reason to do that project. So they were just interesting projects. On the surface, you would say one's a success, one's a failure, but I wanted to tell this really detailed story about how these socio-technical systems actually emerge and who does what and why does someone do something and not another thing. So in this map, and in both of these maps, I have the voices of non-human actants. So things like the App Store is talking as if they are an actor in the system, because with this idea of symmetry between human and non-human actors, you have to talk about things on equal terms in symmetry. So I arranged these maps, and they were little bits of newspaper articles that people referred to. They were media releases. They were anything that someone in an interview mentioned as having an influence on the project. I would include an excerpt of that if I could, or create a voice for it when it wasn't otherwise mentioned. So there's things like media releases from Gladys Berejiklian talking about how great it is that they've done all this amazing work and there's new apps. But then if you dig under the surface, you're like, well, they weren't the only person involved in this, and there's a lot of reasons why, based on legacy systems and things they have, which are all actors in the system, they end up with a certain thing that they end up with. So here's the App Store algorithm saying your app needs to play by my rules or else you'll sink like a rock in a pond, never to be seen again, good luck. And then a bus driver here who's dealing with the brunt of these apps being released and people now complaining about how the bus is 15 minutes late and where were you? Whereas before that he didn't actually have to deal with that. And these are lived experiences of what happens in that transport system when those things come out. And so this was one of the units on the Sydney buses called PTIPS, which is a GPS tracker that's on the buses. So that's the unit which helps Transport for New South Wales manage their contracts, but it also is now the data that's used to tell you where buses are with the real-time app. So they had a real problem for a while there that they had an on-off switch, and the contractors could, when they were late, just turn off the machine. So here's the machine saying, you know, you didn't design me well enough. I didn't know the intended future that this would be a problem. And that's also the device that helps the traffic lights change when you're on a bus, so you have more greens. And so, yeah, I had interviews from a lot of the people in these organisations talking about this perfect storm where, you know, we'd experimented with these things. It all kind of came together. We'd done prototypes in the past, and so I would talk about those prototypes that came in the past. And so that map, instead of looking at just 2 years of when the project actually happened, it ended up going back about 15 years to when people said things actually started moving to lead to that. So I use those pragmatist kind of ideas to unpack the smart city and to really start again to move back as to like why do we think about things in this way, and how can we push back and go back upstream before we come back and describe things again. Moves from homogeneous, which is like one type of thing when you talk about it, to heterogeneous, so combinations of of things, human, non-human, moves away from that definition of entities and moves to relations between those entities, moving from stable concepts to emergent, constantly changing. So I think that by redesigning design, we can understand systems better and really challenge the paradigms out of which these systems arise. And so Micah before was talking about system dynamics. So Donella Meadows, who she was mentioning, the highest level she thinks to intervene in a system is the paradigm. So if we challenge the paradigms that the whole built world is based on, can we come up with actual solutions to some of these massive problems? But the design of systems really needs this plurality of perspectives. So lots of different perspectives. That was just one way you can look at a system. And I mean, if you'd asked any single person I interviewed, I mean, you can see their quotes on here. They all say different things about what matters and what happened. So pragmatism is just a really fascinating way, I find, of re-describing our world outside of these categories and ideas that have kind of dominated our thinking for the last few hundred years. So that's me.
Drinks and just relax for about 15 minutes and then we'll reconvene. So if you have questions, think about them over the break and we'll have a discussion when we get that.